My cousin Jessica was mid-sentence, telling everyone at the family barbecue how I was the biggest disappointment in the Williams family history, when the thunderous roar of helicopter blades suddenly drowned out her voice and a sleek government aircraft, emblazoned with the state seal, descended toward our backyard. As Governor Patricia Morrison herself stepped out onto our lawn in her navy blazer and approached me with an official folder, the same relatives who had spent the afternoon mocking my life choices fell silent for the first time in years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Williams family's annual 4th of July barbecue in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. The backyard was decorated with red, white, and blue streamers that had seen better years, folding tables laden with potato salad and corn on the cob, and the familiar soundtrack of family dysfunction disguised as celebration. 3 generations of my relatives had gathered under the desert sun to continue their time-honored tradition of competitive judgment and thinly veiled criticism, wrapped in the pretense of family bonding. I stood near the weathered picnic table where I had been assigned to bring the paper plates and plastic utensils, wearing a simple sundress from Target that I had chosen specifically because it was comfortable rather than impressive. At 32 years old, I had learned to dress for survival rather than approval when attending these gatherings. The last thing I wanted was to provide additional ammunition for the inevitable critiques of my appearance, my career choices, or my general failure to meet the Williams family standards of conventional success. My Aunt Patricia, who insisted everyone call her Aunt Trish despite her recent marriage making her technically a step relative, had positioned herself at the center of the patio furniture arrangement like a queen holding court. She wore a designer sundress that probably cost more than my monthly rent and jewelry that caught the light with every dismissive gesture. Her latest husband, Uncle Bradley, a successful real estate developer who had joined the family through marriage, but somehow commanded more respect than those of us born into it, nodded approvingly at everything she said while manning the expensive gas grill he had purchased for the family property. Well, Aunt Trish announced as I approached with my assigned contribution to the feast, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sweetness that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to public humiliation. Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence. Rebecca, darling, we were just discussing career achievements and family contributions. Please, tell everyone what you have been up to lately. The conversation around the patio came to an expectant halt. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Children stopped running between the adults. Even the family dog seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. I recognized this setup from previous gathering. This was the moment when the family would collectively assess my life and find it wanting. The annual ritual where my failures would be cataloged and discussed for the entertainment of relatives who measured worth through bank account balances and social media appearances. My cousin Jessica, Aunt Trish's eldest daughter who had recently completed her MBA and never missed an opportunity to mention it, leaned forward in her chair with the predatory smile of someone who had been waiting all afternoon for this exact moment. Jessica had always been the family's designated success story, the golden child whose achievements were constantly referenced as the standard against which everyone else was measured. She had graduated from Arizona State University with honors, landed a management position at a prominent marketing firm, and married a lawyer whose family owned vacation properties in 3 states. "Oh, this should be interesting," Jessica said, her voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. The last time we all got together, Rebecca was telling us about her exciting career in social work. "How is that working out for you? Are you still helping homeless people and making, $30,000 a year?" The laughter that rippled through the gathering was not the kind that brings families together. It was calculated, cruel, and designed to establish hierarchy rather than create connection. Uncle Bradley chuckled while flipping burgers that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My younger cousins, who had been raised to equate financial success with personal worth, exchanged glances that mixed amusement with pity. Even my own mother, Linda Williams, shifted uncomfortably in her lawn chair but said nothing to defend me. I had prepared for this moment during the drive from my apartment to the family property. I had rehearsed responses that were dignified but not defensive, honest but not vulnerable. I had reminded myself that their opinions reflected their values rather than my worth. that financial success was only one measure of a meaningful life, and that I had chosen my path based on principles rather than profit. But standing there under the Arizona sun, surrounded by people who shared my DNA but not my priorities, I felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood by the people who were supposed to understand me most. I am still working in social services, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I recently completed my master's degree in public administration, and I have been developing programs that address systemic issues in our community support network. Aunt Trish waved her hand dismissively, her wedding rings catching the sunlight as she gestured. Oh, Rebecca, always with the fancy words for simple things. You work at a nonprofit, Tunny. You help poor people fill out paperwork. There is nothing wrong with that, of course. But let us call it what it is. You chose a career in charity work while the rest of us built actual businesses and contributed to the economy. The word charity hung in the air like an accusation. In the Williams family economy, charity was something successful people did with their excess wealth, not something capable people did with their professional lives. The distinction was fundamental to their worldview. Productive people created value and accumulated resources, while less capable people redistributed resources that others had created. By choosing social work over business, I had self-selected into the latter category. My cousin Michael, Jessica's younger brother who had recently started his own consulting firm, decided to join the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who had found an opportunity to demonstrate his own superiority. I mean, it is admirable that Rebecca wants to help people, he said, his tone suggesting that admiration and respect were entirely different concepts. But at some point, you have to ask yourself whether you are actually helping or just enabling dependence. The private sector creates jobs and generates tax revenue that funds all these government programs. Without successful businesses, there would be no money for social workers to distribute. This was a familiar argument, one that I had encountered countless times in professional settings, academic conferences, and family gatherings. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how social systems function, how economic inequality perpetuates itself, and how public sector work creates value that cannot be measured through quarterly profit reports. But explaining these concepts to people who had already decided that profit maximization was the highest form of human achievement felt like attempting to teach calculus to individuals who refused to acknowledge the existence of mathematics. Michael makes an excellent point, Uncle Bradley added, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in business settings. The economy runs on entrepreneurship and innovation. Social programs are necessary, I suppose, but they are essentially overhead costs that successful people pay to maintain social stability. Rebecca, you are basically a middle manager in the redistribution business. The characterization stung because it revealed how completely they misunderstood not just my work but the entire concept of public service. In their framework, government and nonprofit organizations existed primarily to address problems that private enterprise could not solve profitably, making public sector workers the cleanup crew for capitalism's inevitable failure. They could not conceptualize the possibility that some problems required solutions that prioritized effectiveness over efficiency, or that some achievements could not be measured through revenue generation. Jessica, sensing that the conversation had not yet reached its crescendo of humiliation, decided to escalate with the precision of someone who had been perfecting this particular form of emotional violence for decades. The thing that I find most interesting about Rebecca's choices, she said, pausing to ensure that everyone was paying attention, is that she had every opportunity to succeed in the traditional sense. She was always smart in school. She could have gone to business school or law school or medical school. Instead, she chose to work in government bureaucracy for poverty wages, while living in a rental apartment and driving a car that is older than some of my shoes. The assembled relatives nodded in agreement, murmuring their consent to this analysis. In their assessment, my life represented a series of poor decisions that had led to predictable consequences. I had possessed the raw materials for conventional success but had chosen to squander them on idealistic pursuits that produced neither wealth nor status. I was not a victim of circumstances beyond my control, but rather a cautionary tale about what happened when intelligent people made foolish choices. My mother finally spoke, her voice carrying the particular quality of disappointment that only parents can achieve. Rebecca has always been stubborn about doing things her own way, she said, as if independence were a character flaw rather than a strength. I tried to convince her to get her teaching certificate or go into nursing, something stable with good benefit, but she insisted on this public policy track, and now look where she is. The phrase "now look where she is" echoed in my mind as I stood there in the desert heat, surrounded by people who measured my worth through their own limited understanding of success. They looked at me and saw someone who had failed to optimize her life for financial gain. They saw wasted potential, poor judgment, and the inevitable consequences of prioritizing principles over profit. They saw a 32-year-old woman who rented instead of owned, who drove a reliable car instead of a luxury vehicle, who worked for community impact instead of personal advance. What they could not see was the comprehensive policy framework I had developed for addressing homelessness in metropolitan Phoenix. They could not see the federal grant proposals I had written that had brought millions of dollars in funding to Arizona nonprofits. They could not see the late nights I had spent analyzing data, writing reports, and building coalitions between organizations that had never collaborated before. They could not see the families who had found stable housing, the veterans who had received mental health services, or the children who had access to educational programs because of systems I had designed and implemented. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most importantly, they could not see the phone calls I had been receiving from Washington, D.C., over the past 3 months. Aunt Trish stood up from her chair with the theatrical flourish of someone preparing to deliver a closing argument. She had been building toward this moment all afternoon, gathering ammunition from various family members' contributions to the conversation, and now she was ready to deliver the definitive assessment of my life choices. "Rebecca, sweetheart," she began, her voice carrying the false compassion of someone who enjoyed delivering painful truths. "I think what everyone is trying to say is that we are concerned about your future. You are 32 years old. You are not married. You do not own property. You do not have children. You work for the government, making less money than Jessica spends on her car payment. At what point do you acknowledge that this experiment in social justice has failed and that you need to make some practical decisions about your life?" The silence that followed was deafening. 37 relatives stopped their conversations, their eating, their casual socializing, to witness what felt like a public tribunal designed to convict me of the crime of living according to my values rather than their expectations. Children looked back and forth between the adults, sensing tension they did not understand, but recognizing that something significant was happening. The only sounds were the sizzling of meat on the grill, and the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the Arizona heat. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to explain that success could be measured through impact rather than income, that meaningful work sometimes required accepting lower financial compensation, that I had chosen purpose over profit, because I believed that some problems were more important than personal advancement. But before I could speak, the sound of helicopter blades cut through the afternoon air with increasing intensity. At first, everyone assumed it was a news helicopter heading toward downtown Phoenix, or perhaps a medical transport flying toward one of the major hospitals. Helicopters were not uncommon in the metropolitan area, and their presence rarely drew sustained attention from people accustomed to urban life, but this aircraft was flying lower than usual, and its sound was growing louder rather than fading as it passed overhead. Jessica, who had been preparing her own contribution to the character assassination, paused mid-sentence as the noise became impossible to ignore. Uncle Bradley looked up from the grill with mild annoyance, clearly irritated that his cooking narrative was being interrupted by external distraction. The children, however, immediately ran to the center of the yard, pointing excitedly at the sky and shouting about the helicopter that was circling their neighborhood. "That thing is awfully low," my mother observed, shading her eyes with her hand as she attempted to track the aircraft's move. "I hope everything is all right. Maybe there was an accident nearby, but I knew exactly why the helicopter was circling our area, and I knew exactly where it was planning to land." 3 days earlier, I had received a phone call from Governor Patricia Morrison's chief of staff, informing me that the governor wanted to personally deliver an offer that could not be communicated through normal channels. The conversation had been brief, formal and completely confidential. I had been instructed to maintain my normal schedule and not discuss the impending contact with anyone, including family members. The helicopter descended toward the open space behind the Williams family property, its rotors creating a windstorm that sent paper plates flying and forced everyone to hold onto their hats and lightweight clothing. The aircraft was sleek, official and unmistakably governmental, with the Arizona state seal prominently displayed on its sides and professional pilot uniforms visible through the cockpit window. As the helicopter touched down on the grassy area behind our yard, the assembled relatives stood frozen in various stages of confusion, disbelief, and growing realization that something extraordinary was happening. The casual cruelty of our conversation had been interrupted by an event that none of them could have anticipated or prepared for. The aircraft's engines wound down, and the rotor blades gradually slowed their rotation. A moment later, the passenger door opened and Governor Patricia Morrison stepped out onto the ground. She was exactly as she appeared in official photographs and television interviews, confident, professional, and carrying herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of people. Governor Morrison was followed by 2 additional passengers: her chief of staff, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s carrying an official folder, and a security detail member who immediately began surveying the area with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in executive protection. The governor walked directly toward our gathering with purposeful strides, her navy blazer immaculate despite the helicopter journey and her expression serious but not unfriendly. She approached the patio where 37 members of the Williams family stood in various stages of shock, their mouths open and their previous conversations completely forgotten. "Good afternoon," Governor Morrison said, her voice carrying easily across the silent yard. "I am looking for Rebecca Williams. I understand she might be here today." Every pair of eyes turned toward me with laser focus. The same relatives who had spent the previous hour cataloging my failures and questioning my life choices suddenly found themselves staring at me with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning comprehension to something approaching awe. I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "I am Rebecca Williams, Governor Morrison." The governor smiled, extending her hand for a professional handshake that seemed to last longer than strictly necessary. "Ms. Williams, I apologize for interrupting your family gathering, but I have something important to discuss with you that could not wait for Monday morning." She gestured to her chief of staff, who opened the official folder and removed a document bearing the state seal and multiple signatures. "Ms. Williams, I am here to formally offer you the position of Director of Community Development and Social Innovation for the state of Arizona. This is a newly created cabinet-level position that will oversee a $200 million initiative to address systemic poverty, homelessness, and social services coordination across all Arizona counties. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ear. 37 relatives, who had been convinced that I was a failure, a disappointment, a cautionary tale about wasted potential, suddenly found themselves witnessing the governor of Arizona personally recruiting me for one of the most significant policy positions in state government. Aunt Tricia's mouth was hanging open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. Jessica appeared to be experiencing some form of cognitive dissonance that prevented her from processing what she was seeing. Uncle Bradley had completely forgotten about the burgers on the grill, which were now smoking ominously behind him. My mother looked as if she were seeing me for the first time in 32 years, Governor Morrison continued, apparently unaware of the family drama that had preceded her arrival. "Your work on the Phoenix Homeless Prevention Initiative caught the attention of our policy team and several federal agencies. The comprehensive approach you developed has become a model that other states are studying. We need someone with your expertise and innovation to lead this statewide expansion." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "The position comes with a cabinet-level salary, full state benefits, and direct reporting to my office. You would be responsible for coordinating with federal agencies, managing relationships with nonprofit organizations across the state, and implementing the most ambitious social services reform in Arizona history." I accepted the folder from the chief of staff, my hands surprisingly steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. Inside were formal job descriptions, salary information that made my current income look like pocket change, and organizational charts showing my position at the highest levels of state government. "Governor Morrison," I said, my voice carrying across the silent yard where my family stood transfixed. I am honored by this offer and excited about the opportunity to serve Arizona in this capacity. When would you need my answer? The governor smiled. Take the weekend to review everything, but I hope you will accept. Arizona needs leaders who understand that effective policy requires both analytical rigor and genuine commitment to community welfare. Your background demonstrates both quality. She turned to address the assembled family members, who were still standing in various stages of shock. You should be very proud of Rebecca. Her work has already improved lives throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, and now she has the opportunity to expand that impact statewide. You are fortunate to have someone with her dedication and expertise in your family. With that, Governor Morrison shook my hand once more, nodded politely to the gathering, and walked back toward the helicopter with her staff. The aircraft's engines began to wind up again, and within minutes, the governor of Arizona was airborne, leaving behind a backyard full of relatives who suddenly had to recalibrate everything they thought they knew about my life and my capability. As the helicopter disappeared over the Phoenix skyline, I looked around at the faces of family members who had spent the afternoon treating me like a failure. The expressions I saw ranged from confusion to embarrassment to something that might have been For the first time in years of family gatherings, no one seemed to know what to say. Jessica was the first to break the silence, her voice small and uncertain. Rebecca, I had no idea you were involved in anything like that. Why did not you tell us? I looked at my cousin, this woman who had spent years measuring her worth through external achievements, and assuming that everyone else should do the same. Because you never asked, I replied simply. You asked about my salary and my apartment, and my car. You never asked about my work or my goals or what I was trying to accomplish. Aunt Trish approached me with an expression I had never seen before, something that might have been humility mixed with genuine curiosity. Rebecca, honey, that woman just offered you a position in the governor's cabinet. How long has this been developing? I smiled, feeling a peace that had been absent from family gatherings for as long as I could remember. About 3 years of work, 6 months of interviews, and 3 days of final security clearances, I said, but the foundation has been building since I decided that meaningful work was more important to me than impressive job titles or high salary. As I walked toward the house to call my supervisor and begin the process of transitioning my current responsibilities, I heard Uncle Bradley turn off the grill and mutter to his wife, I guess we should probably ask her more about what she actually does for work. The woman they had called a loser 30 minutes earlier was now someone they wanted to understand. The career they had dismissed as charity work was now something they recognized as public service. The life choices they had criticized were now decisions they wanted to comprehend. But more than that, I had proven to myself that living according to your values, rather than other people's expectations, does not guarantee immediate recognition, but it does guarantee authentic achievement. And sometimes, if you persist long enough, and work effectively enough, those achievements become impossible for even skeptical family members to ignore. I was no longer asking for their approval. I was finally in a position where I did not need it. The path that led to Governor Morrison's helicopter landing in my family's backyard began 7 years earlier in the most unlikely place imaginable, the overnight shift at the Maricopa County Emergency Services Center. While my cousins were building their resumes through prestigious internships and networking events, I was answering crisis hotline calls from 3 in the morning until dawn, learning about human desperation in ways that no business school case study could ever teach. My first night at the crisis center was September 15th, exactly 3 months after I had completed my bachelor's degree in social work from Arizona State University. The graduation ceremony had been a source of quiet pride for me and visible disappointment for my family, who had spent 4 years hoping I would change my major to something more financially viable. My mother had attended the ceremony but spent most of the reception explaining to other parents that I was still figuring things out, and might pursue graduate school in a more practical field. The Emergency Services Center occupied the 3rd floor of a nondescript government building in downtown Phoenix, the kind of institutional architecture that prioritized function over aesthetic. The walls were painted in the particular shade of beige that seemed standard for all municipal facilities, and the fluorescent lighting created the perpetual sensation of being slightly underwater. But for me, walking into that building represented the beginning of real professional education, the kind that came from direct contact with the problems I wanted to solve, rather than theoretical discussions about them. My supervisor, Dr. Margaret Chen was a woman in her early 50s who had spent 23 years working in various capacities within Arizona's social services infrastructure. She possessed the particular combination of pragmatic wisdom and idealistic determination that characterized people who had remained committed to public service despite repeated budget cuts, political interference, and societal indifference to the populations they serve. During my first week of training, she shared a perspective that would fundamentally shape my approach to the work ahead. "Rebecca," she said as we reviewed case files during a quiet period between calls, "most people who work in social services approach this field with either bleeding hearts or clinical detachment. The bleeding hearts burn out within 2 years because they cannot maintain emotional equilibrium when confronted with suffering they cannot immediately fix. The clinically detached ones last longer but become increasingly ineffective because they lose sight of the human beings behind the case number." She paused to answer an incoming call, spending 12 minutes talking a homeless veteran through the process of accessing emergency shelter during a particularly cold September night. After completing the call and documenting the interaction, she continued her observation. "The people who succeed in this field long-term learn to maintain what I call compassionate analytical thinking. You have to care enough about outcomes to invest genuine emotional energy in the work, but you also have to think systematically about root causes rather than just addressing immediate symptoms. Most importantly, you have to understand that individual cases are data points in larger patterns, and that solving individual problems requires understanding systemic dysfunctions." This perspective became the foundation for everything I would accomplish over the following 7 years. Each crisis call I handled was simultaneously a human being in immediate need, and a piece of evidence about how existing systems were failing to address predictable problems. Each case I documented contributed to my understanding of why certain interventions succeeded while others failed. Each interaction taught me something about the gap between policy intentions and implementation realities. The overnight shift meant that I encountered situations that day shift workers rarely experience. The people who called emergency services between midnight and 8 in the morning were often dealing with crises that had been building for weeks or months, without adequate intervention. They were individuals who had exhausted other resources, who had fallen through cracks in service delivery systems, or who were experiencing emergencies that revealed fundamental flaws in how social support networks operate. During my second month at the crisis center, I received a call that would fundamentally change my understanding of how homelessness actually functioned in metropolitan Phoenix. The caller was Sandra Martinez, a 38-year-old single mother of 2 children who had been evicted from her apartment 3 days earlier. She had been staying in her car with her 8-year-old daughter and 5-year-old son, trying to maintain some semblance of routine while searching for emergency housing assistance. Sandra's situation was particularly instructive because she did not fit the stereotypical profile that most people associated with homelessness. She had been steadily employed as a medical billing clerk for 4 years, earning enough income to cover rent, utilities, and basic necessities for her family. Her housing crisis had been triggered by a series of interconnected events that individually seemed manageable but collectively created an insurmountable challenge. First, her car had required emergency repairs that cost $800, forcing her to use money that had been earmarked for rent. Then, her daughter had developed a respiratory infection that required multiple doctor visits and prescription medications not fully covered by her health insurance plan. Finally, her employer had reduced her hours by 12 per week as part of a cost-cutting initiative, decreasing her monthly income by approximately $300. Any one of these events would have created financial stress but not necessarily housing instability. The combination of all three occurring within a 6-week period had made it impossible for Sandra to meet her rental obligations. Her landlord had initiated eviction proceedings after she fell 2 months behind on rent, and the legal process had moved faster than her ability to secure emergency assistance or find alternative housing. Sandra had contacted 17 different organizations, seeking help during the 3 weeks between receiving her eviction notice and actually losing her apartment. She had called county social services, nonprofit housing organizations, religious institutions, and community assistance programs. In each case, she had been told that resources were limited, waiting lists were extensive, or her situation did not meet specific eligibility criteria for immediate assistance. The most frustrating aspect of Sandra's experience was that no single organization had comprehensive information about all available resources, and none of them had procedures for coordinating with other agencies to address complex situations that cross traditional service boundaries. She had spent hours on hold, filled out dozens of applications, attended multiple intake appointments, and provided the same documentation repeatedly to different organizations that did not communicate with each other. By the time Sandra called the emergency crisis line, she had been living in her car for 3 days and had exhausted most of her options. Her children were struggling to maintain hygiene and complete homework assignments. She was afraid that someone would report her to Child Protective Services for inadequate housing, which could result in her children being placed in foster care. She was also worried about losing her job if her employer discovered her housing situation, since medical billing work required reliable transportation and professional appearance. I spent 47 minutes on the phone with Sandra that night, not because finding resources required that much time, but because understanding her situation well enough to provide effective assistance required comprehensive assessment of multiple interconnected challenges. During our conversation, I documented 15 different agencies she had already contacted, 12 types of assistance she had applied for, and 7 bureaucratic obstacles that had prevented her from accessing help despite meeting eligibility requirements. More importantly, I began to understand that Sandra's experience was not unique. Over the following months, I received dozens of similar calls from working families who had become homeless not due to substance abuse, mental illness, or chronic unemployment, but because of temporary financial crises that existing support systems were not designed to address effectively. These families typically earn too much money to qualify for certain assistance programs, but too little money to survive unexpected expenses. They often had employment histories and rental references that should have made them attractive to landlords, but they could not access housing because they lacked sufficient savings for security deposits and first month's rent. They were frequently caught between programs designed for chronic homelessness and programs designed for poverty prevention, falling into gaps that no existing system acknowledged or addressed. After 6 months of documenting these patterns, I approached Chen with a proposal that would consume the next 2 years of my life. I wanted to develop a comprehensive database that tracked not just individual service requests, but the systemic patterns that created recurring crises. Instead of simply responding to emergencies as they occurred, I wanted to analyze why the same types of emergencies kept occurring, and what interventions might prevent them. Dr. Chen was initially skeptical about the feasibility of such an undertaking. The crisis center was understaffed and operating with technology systems that were several generations behind current standards. Creating comprehensive tracking mechanisms would require additional work that we could not easily accommodate within existing schedules. More importantly, the data analysis I was proposing would only be valuable if it led to actual policy changes, and the political environment for social services innovation was particularly challenging at that time. However, Dr. Chen also recognized that my proposal addressed fundamental inefficiencies in how emergency services operated. The crisis center was spending increasing amounts of time managing repeat callers who were cycling through the same unsuccessful resource referral. Caseworkers were becoming frustrated with their inability to provide sustainable solutions to recurring problems. Most significantly, the cost of emergency interventions was escalating while outcomes remained consistently poor. After 3 weeks of consideration, Dr. Chen agreed to support my project on the condition that I could develop the database and conduct the analysis without compromising my primary responsibilities for handling crisis calls. This meant that my additional research would need to be completed during breaks between calls, during slow periods on overnight shifts, and during my personal time outside of work. I accepted these conditions immediately, understanding that this opportunity represented far more than just a professional development exercise. I was being given the chance to study social services delivery from the inside, to identify systemic problems that could be addressed through better coordination and resource allocation, and to develop evidence-based recommendations for improving outcomes while reducing costs. The database I created tracked 23 different variables for each crisis call, including demographic information about callers, types of assistance requested, agencies contacted prior to calling the crisis line, barriers encountered in accessing services, and follow-up outcomes when available. I also began tracking broader patterns, such as seasonal fluctuations in different types of crises, geographic clustering of service gaps, and correlations between specific policy changes and subsequent service demand. Within 8 months, I had documented 12,247 individual crisis calls and identified 17 distinct patterns that suggested opportunities for systemic improvement. The most significant pattern involved what I termed bureaucratic ping-pong situations where individuals in need of assistance were referred repeatedly between agencies without receiving effective help, because no single organization had comprehensive intake procedures or coordination mechanisms with other service providers. The second major pattern involved eligibility gap crises, situations where individuals needed assistance but could not access existing programs because their circumstances fell between different agencies' service criteria. These cases typically involved people whose incomes were slightly above poverty thresholds, but insufficient to manage unexpected expenses, or families whose housing crises had been caused by temporary rather than chronic problems. The third pattern involved documentation barriers, situations where individuals who qualified for assistance could not access it because they lacked specific forms of identification, proof of income, or other paperwork requirements. These barriers were particularly problematic for people experiencing homelessness, who often lost important documents during housing transitions, or could not maintain mailing addresses required for receiving replacement documents. After completing 18 months of data collection and analysis, I had developed a comprehensive report that documented how existing social services systems were structured in ways that created inefficiency, frustration, and poor outcomes for the people they were designed to serve. The report included specific recommendations for coordination mechanisms, eligibility streamlining, and policy modifications that could improve service delivery while reducing administrative cost. Chan reviewed my findings and recommended that I present them to the Maricopa County Social Services Advisory Committee, a group of agency directors, nonprofit leaders, and community representatives who met quarterly to discuss coordination and resource allocation issues. This presentation would be my first opportunity to address policy-level decision-makers with evidence-based recommendations for systemic improvement. The advisory committee meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in the county administration building, in a conference room that probably cost more to furnish than the crisis center's annual technology budget. 12 individuals attended the meeting representing organizations that collectively managed over $40 million in annual funding for various social services programs throughout Maricopa. I had prepared a 20-minute presentation that summarized my key findings and recommendations, supported by data visualizations that illustrated the patterns I had identified. However, I had also prepared for the possibility that committee members would be skeptical about recommendations coming from a crisis center worker rather than from academic researchers or consulting firms. My presentation focused on 3 main themes. First, I demonstrated that current service delivery systems were creating unnecessary administrative costs through duplicated intake procedures, inefficient referral processes, and poor coordination between agents. Second, I showed that many service gaps could be addressed through relatively modest policy modifications rather than through additional funding or new programs. Third, I argued that improving outcomes for service recipients would also reduce long-term costs for service providers by addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms. The response to my presentation was more positive than I had anticipated, but also more complex than I had expected. Several committee members expressed genuine interest in my findings and asked detailed questions about specific recommendations. Others seemed skeptical about whether the solutions I was proposing were politically feasible, given existing agency relationships and funding structure. The most significant response came from David Rodriguez, the director of Maricopa County Community Development, who asked whether I would be interested in conducting a more comprehensive study that would examine social services coordination across the entire metropolitan Phoenix area, rather than just focusing on crisis center data. This question represented the next phase of my professional development and the beginning of work that would eventually attract Governor Morrison's attention. But accepting Rodriguez's offer would require leaving the crisis center and transitioning into a research position that came with greater responsibilities, higher visibility, and significantly more pressure to produce actionable results. It would also require convincing my family that I was making career progress, rather than simply changing jobs within the same underpaid sector of public service. At that point, they still viewed my work as a temporary phase that I would eventually outgrow in favor of more conventional career paths. They could not understand that I was systematically building expertise in an area that would eventually position me for leadership roles they never imagined existed. Standing in the county conference room listening to David Rodriguez describe the scope of the research project he was proposing, I realized that I was being offered the opportunity to transition from responding to social problems to actually solving them. The work would be challenging, the pay would still be modest compared to private sector alternatives, and my family would likely continue to view my choices as evidence of limited ambition. But I also understood that this was exactly the kind of opportunity I had been preparing for during 2 years of overnight shifts, data collection, and pattern analysis. I was being invited to move from individual case management to systems-level policy development, from crisis response to prevention planning, from documenting problems to implementing solutions. I accepted Rodriguez's offer that afternoon, understanding that I was committing myself to work that would be more demanding, more visible, and more consequential than anything I had previously undertaken. I was also committing myself to proving that meaningful social change could be accomplished through rigorous analysis, strategic planning, and persistent implementation of evidence-based solutions. The Crisis Center had taught me how social services systems failed individual people in crisis. The county research position would teach me how to redesign those systems to prevent crises from occurring in the first place, and eventually that knowledge would position me to lead the most ambitious social services reform initiative in Arizona history. But first I had to convince my family that I was building a career rather than just changing jobs, and that public service could be a form of professional achievement, rather than simply an alternative to professional success. That conversation would prove to be almost as challenging as the policy work itself. The Maricopa County Community Development Office occupied 2 floors of a downtown Phoenix building that had been constructed during the 1970s urban renewal period, when government architecture favored concrete functionality over aesthetic consideration. My new workspace consisted of a standard-issue desk, a computer that took 3 minutes to boot up, and access to filing cabinets containing 20 years of research reports that previous analysts had generated and subsequently forgotten. The office environment was precisely what my family expected from government work: institutional, underfunded, and seemingly disconnected from the dynamic energy of private sector innovation. What they could not see was that I had been given unprecedented access to comprehensive data about how social services operated across the 4th largest metropolitan area in the United States. David Rodriguez had assigned me to conduct what he termed a complete systems analysis of service delivery coordination throughout Maricopa County, with particular emphasis on identifying opportunities for improved efficiency and effectiveness. The scope of this analysis would encompass housing assistance, employment services, mental health programs, substance abuse treatment, veterans services, and family support programs, administered by dozens of different organizations. Rodriguez explained the project parameters during my first week in the new position, emphasizing that this research would inform policy recommendations that could potentially reshape how social services operated throughout Arizona. The state legislature was considering significant changes to social services funding mechanisms, and county administrators needed evidence-based recommendations for maximizing the impact of available resources while improving outcomes for service recipients. The magnitude of this responsibility was both exhilarating and intimidating. I would be analyzing systems that affected hundreds of thousands of people annually, with total budgets exceeding $150 million. My recommendations could influence policy decisions that would determine whether families found stable housing, whether veterans received adequate mental health support, and whether communities could effectively address substance abuse and homelessness. This was exactly the kind of work I had envisioned when I chose social work as my field of study, but I had never expected to encounter such opportunities so early in my career. The first challenge involved developing methodologies for comparing programs that used different assessment criteria, served different populations, and measured success through different metrics. Housing assistance programs tracked families moved into stable housing. Employment services measured job placements and wage improvements. Mental health programs monitored symptom reduction and treatment compliance, and substance abuse programs focused on sobriety maintenance and relapse prevention. Each program had developed evaluation approaches that made sense within their specific context, but no organization had attempted to analyze how these different interventions interacted or whether they achieved better outcomes when coordinated systematically. I spent the first month creating what I termed a unified assessment framework that could analyze different types of social services using consistent criteria while respecting the unique aspects of each program type. This framework examined 5 dimensions of program effectiveness: accessibility for eligible populations, efficiency and resource utilization, sustainability of outcomes achieved, coordination with complementary services, and systemic impact on community-wide indicators. The accessibility analysis revealed that most social services programs had developed intake procedures that prioritized administrative convenience over user experience. Potential service recipients typically needed to complete separate application processes for each type of assistance they required, often providing identical documentation multiple times to different organizations that maintained independent databases. These duplicated procedures created unnecessary barriers for people who were already dealing with complex personal challenges, while also generating administrative costs that consumed resources that could otherwise be directed toward direct service. More problematic was the discovery that intake procedures often required documentation that homeless individuals could not easily obtain or maintain. Proof of income requirements assumed that applicants had consistent employment and mailing address. Identity verification procedures required official documents that people frequently lost during housing transitions. Residency requirements demanded evidence of local connections that newly arrived individuals could not provide. These documentation barriers effectively excluded many of the people who most needed assistance, while creating administrative burdens that consumed significant staff time without improving service quality. The efficiency analysis examined how different organizations allocated resources between direct services and administrative overhead. This investigation revealed substantial variation and administrative costs across similar programs, suggesting that some organizations had developed more effective operational approaches than others. More significantly, I discovered that lack of coordination between organizations created systematic inefficiencies that affected all participating agencies. For example, I documented dozens of cases where individuals received duplicated services from multiple organizations, while other eligible people remained on waiting lists for the same services. Mental health clinics were providing substance abuse counseling to clients who were simultaneously receiving substance abuse treatment from specialized programs. Housing assistance organizations were conducting separate housing searches for different clients who could potentially share accommodations. Employment services were providing job training in industries that other programs had identified as having limited local opportunity. These coordination failures occurred not because of incompetence or poor intentions, but because organizations lacked systematic mechanisms for sharing information about client needs, service utilization, and available resources. Each agency operated according to internal procedures that made sense within their organizational context, but created system-wide inefficiencies when multiple agencies served overlapping populations. The sustainability analysis examined whether short-term interventions produced lasting improvements in client circumstances or merely provided temporary relief that required repeated assistance. This investigation yielded the most significant findings of my entire research project and would eventually become the foundation for policy innovations that attracted statewide attention. I discovered that traditional approaches to social services delivery were optimized for managing crises rather than preventing them. Organizations measured success primarily through immediate outputs such as meals served, beds provided, or counseling sessions completed, rather than through long-term outcomes such as sustained housing stability, employment retention, or reduced need for ongoing assistance. This focus on immediate service delivery created systematic incentives for organizations to prioritize quantity of services over quality of outcome. Accepting this position would require relocating to a state-level role that came with significantly greater responsibilities and modestly improved compensation, but it would also mean leaving the county research position where I had developed expertise and established credibility. More importantly, it would involve designing and managing programs that would be evaluated by federal agencies, making my work subject to national scrutiny and potential criticism if implementation did not achieve projected outcomes. The decision represented a choice between continuing to build expertise within a familiar environment or accepting the challenge of applying that expertise to larger-scale problems with higher stakes and greater visibility. It also represented an opportunity to prove that evidence-based social policy could achieve measurable improvements in efficiency and effectiveness, potentially influencing how social services operated throughout Arizona and serving as a model for other states. After discussing the opportunity with Dr. Chen, who had become an informal mentor throughout my transition from crisis center work to policy research, I decided to accept the state position. Chen encouraged me to view this transition as the natural progression from identifying problems to solving them, from analyzing existing systems to designing better alternatives, and from conducting research to implementing evidence-based innovation. The evening I accepted the state position, I called my mother to inform her about the career transition. Her response was predictably focused on practical considerations such as salary increases, benefits improvements, and whether state employment would provide better job security than county work. She seemed pleased that I was advancing within government service, but continued to express hope that I would eventually consider transitioning to private sector employment, where my education and analytical skills could generate higher financial return. I attempted to explain that I was being recruited for this position because of expertise I had developed through 4 years of specialized experience in social services research and policy analysis, and that this transition represented recognition of professional competence rather than simply advancement within a government bureaucracy. However, I also understood that my family would continue to evaluate my career progress through financial metrics rather than professional impact, until I achieved a level of success that commanded their attention regardless of the sector where it occurred. Standing in my apartment that evening, reviewing the offer materials for my new state position, I realized that I was embarking on work that could potentially influence how social services operated throughout Arizona, while providing the foundation for even broader policy influence in the future. I was also committing myself to proving that rigorous analysis and systematic implementation could achieve meaningful social change, demonstrating that public service could be a form of professional excellence, rather than simply an alternative to private sector success. The coordination and prevention strategies I would be designing and implementing at the state level would eventually become the foundation for policy innovations that attracted federal attention and gubernatorial recognition. But first, I needed to prove that the theoretical frameworks I had developed through research could be translated into operational programs that achieved measurable improvements in real-world conditions. The Arizona Department of Economic Security headquarters occupied a sprawling complex of buildings in central Phoenix that housed the administrative infrastructure for the state's largest social services agency. My new office was located on the 6th floor of the Policy Development Wing, a space that had been specifically designed to support research initiatives and pilot program implementation. Unlike the institutional environments I had grown accustomed to in county facilities, this workspace featured modern technology, comprehensive research databases, and access to analytical tools that could support sophisticated policy development projects. The federal grant that had created my position was part of the Social Innovation Fund, a national initiative designed to identify and scale evidence-based approaches to addressing persistent social challenges. Arizona had been selected as one of 12 states to receive implementation funding based on the quality of our proposal and the potential for developing innovations that could be replicated in other jurisdictions. The grant provided $3 million over 3 years to design, implement, and evaluate pilot programs that could demonstrate measurable improvements in social services effectiveness, while reducing per capita costs. My role as senior policy analyst for innovation development carried responsibilities that extended far beyond traditional research activity. I would be responsible for translating the theoretical frameworks I had developed through county-level analysis into operational pilot programs that could be tested in real-world conditions. This work would require coordinating with multiple state agencies, negotiating partnerships with local service providers, developing comprehensive evaluation methodologies, and managing implementation processes that involved dozens of organizations, serving thousands of individuals annually. The scope of this responsibility was both professionally exciting and personally daunting. The pilot programs I designed would be evaluated by federal oversight agencies, state legislative committees, and academic researchers who specialized in social policy evaluation. Success would position Arizona as a national leader in social services innovation and could influence how other states approached similar challenges. Failure would not only terminate my career advancement, but could also affect funding for social services programs throughout Arizona. Amanda Rodriguez, the Director of Policy Development for the Department of Economic Security, served as my immediate supervisor and primary mentor for navigating the complexities of state-level policy implementation. Rodriguez possessed 15 years of experience in federal and state social policy development, including previous work with the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, and leadership roles in social services agencies in Colorado and New Mexico. Her expertise encompassed both the technical aspects of program design and the political dynamics that influenced implementation success. During my first week in the position, Rodriguez provided an orientation that fundamentally shaped my understanding of how policy innovation functioned within state government structure. She explained that successful pilot programs required more than evidence-based design and rigorous evaluation methodology. They also required careful attention to stakeholder management, political sustainability, and practical implementation challenges that could derail even the most theoretically sound intervention. Rodriguez emphasized that my research background provided essential analytical capabilities for program design, but that translating research findings into operational programs would require developing new skills in project management, organizational coordination, and strategic communication. The pilot programs would need to achieve measurable outcomes while maintaining the support of participating organizations, state agency leadership, and legislative oversight committees that controlled funding for social services programs. The first pilot program I was assigned to develop focused on implementing the coordination mechanisms that my county research had identified as critical for improving service delivery efficiency. The Integrated Services Coordination Initiative would test whether systematic information sharing and coordinated service planning could reduce administrative costs while improving outcomes for individuals and families who required assistance from multiple organizations. The pilot would involve 5 organizations that collectively served approximately 8,000 individuals annually through housing assistance, employment services, mental health programs, substance abuse treatment, and family support services. These organizations had agreed to participate in the coordination initiative based on preliminary presentations about potential benefits, but implementing actual coordination would require developing new procedures, training staff in collaborative approach, and establishing technology systems that could support information sharing while protecting client confidentiality. The complexity of this implementation challenge became apparent during my first coordination meeting with representatives from the participating organization. Each agency operated according to different intake procedures, used different client management systems, maintained different documentation requirements, and followed different confidentiality protocols. Creating coordination mechanisms would require developing common standards that respected each organization's operational requirements while enabling systematic collaboration. More significantly, I discovered that coordination failures were not simply the result of poor communication or inadequate technology. They reflected fundamental differences in organizational cultures, service philosophies, and operational priorities that had developed over decades of independent operation. Housing assistance programs prioritized rapid placement into available units, while employment services focused on comprehensive skill development, that required extended preparation periods. Mental health organizations emphasized therapeutic relationship building that could not be rushed, while substance abuse programs utilized structured treatment protocols with specific timeline requirements. These different approaches were not incompatible, but coordinating them effectively would require developing new frameworks that could accommodate varying operational requirements, while ensuring that clients received comprehensive support for addressing multiple challenges. This coordination challenge was more complex than I had anticipated, based on my county research, requiring deeper understanding of how different service delivery approaches could be integrated without compromising their individual effectiveness. The second pilot program involved implementing prevention-focused approaches that could address housing instability before it escalated into homelessness. The Early Intervention Housing Stability Program would provide intensive support services for families experiencing financial crises that threatened their housing security, with the goal of preventing evictions and avoiding the much higher costs associated with emergency housing assistance and family reunification services. This program design was based on my research finding that prevention interventions typically cost significantly less than crisis interventions, while achieving better long-term outcomes. However, implementing prevention-focused approaches required identifying families at risk of housing instability before they became homeless, developing intervention strategies that could address multiple contributing factors, and creating funding mechanisms that could support upfront investments in prevention services. The identification challenge proved particularly complex because families at risk of housing instability often did not interact with social services systems until they had already lost their housing. Traditional intake procedures were designed to serve individuals who had already experienced housing crises, rather than to identify people who might benefit from prevention service. Developing early identification mechanisms would require establishing relationships with organizations that encountered families during earlier stages of financial stress, such as utility companies, healthcare providers, schools, and community organizations. The intervention challenge involved designing support services that could address the multiple factors that typically contributed to housing instability, including temporary income reductions, unexpected expenses, health emergency, and bureaucratic barriers to accessing existing assistance programs. Effective prevention would require coordinated responses that could provide emergency financial assistance, connect families with appropriate long-term support services, and address systemic barriers that created housing vulnerability. The funding challenge reflected broader constraints in how social services programs were structured and evaluated. Most existing funding sources were designed to support crisis interventions that could demonstrate immediate measurable outputs, such as individuals housed or families reunified. Prevention services generated savings, primarily through avoided costs, which were more difficult to measure and less politically compelling than direct service delivery statistics. After 3 months of design development and stakeholder consultation, I had created detailed implementation plans for both pilot programs that addressed the operational, coordination, and evaluation challenges I had identified. The Integrated Services Coordination Initiative would be implemented through a phased approach that began with information sharing protocols, progressed to coordinated intake procedures, and culminated in comprehensive service planning that involved all participating organizations. The Early Intervention Housing Stability Program would be implemented through partnerships with community organizations that could identify at-risk families, rapid response teams that could provide immediate assistance, and follow-up services that could address underlying vulnerability factors. Rodriguez reviewed my implementation plans and recommended them for approval by the department leadership team, emphasizing that both programs addressed significant opportunities for improving service delivery effectiveness while generating measurable cost savings. The approval process required presentations to the Deputy Director for Program Operations, the Assistant Director for Policy Development, and ultimately the Department Director, who would authorize the allocation of federal grant funds for pilot implementation. The presentation to department leadership represented my first opportunity to communicate policy recommendations to senior state government officials who had authority to approve or reject my proposal. These officials possessed extensive experience in social services administration and policy implementation, but they also operated within political and budgetary constraints that influenced their evaluation of new program initiatives. The Deputy Director for Program Operations, Sarah Chen, focused her questions on the practical implementation challenges that could affect pilot program success. She inquired about staff training requirements, technology system modifications, and potential resistance from participating organizations. Chen also asked about contingency plans for addressing implementation problems that could jeopardize pilot outcomes or create negative publicity for the department. The Assistant Director for Policy Development, Michael Torres, concentrated on the evaluation methodologies that would be used to assess pilot program effectiveness. He requested detailed explanations of outcome measures, data collection procedures, and analytical approaches that would be used to determine whether the interventions achieved projected improvements in service delivery efficiency and client outcome. Torres also asked about timelines for generating preliminary results that could inform decisions about program expansion or modification. Department Director Linda Morrison, who would later become Governor Morrison, asked the most challenging questions about political sustainability and stakeholder management. She inquired about potential opposition from organizations whose current approaches my research had identified as ineffective, legislative oversight requirements that could affect pilot implementation, and communication strategies for managing public expectations about pilot outcomes. Director Morrison also asked whether the coordination and prevention strategies I was proposing could be scaled beyond the pilot phase to achieve statewide impact, and whether successful implementation in Arizona could serve as a model for other states facing similar social services challenges. These questions indicated that department leadership was considering the broader implications of my work and evaluating whether successful pilots could position Arizona as a national leader in social services innovation. Following 3 hours of detailed presentations and discussion, the department leadership team approved both pilot programs and authorized the allocation of federal grant funds for implementation. Director Morrison assigned me to lead a cross-agency implementation team that would coordinate pilot activities across multiple state departments while maintaining oversight of participating local organizations. This approval represented the transition from research and design activities to actual program implementation that would affect thousands of individuals and families, while testing whether evidence-based policy innovations could achieve measurable improvements in real-world conditions. The success or failure of these pilots would determine whether my analytical approaches could be translated into effective operational programs, and whether my career would advance toward greater policy leadership responsibility. The implementation team I was assigned to lead included representatives from the Department of Economic Security, the Department of Housing, the Department of Health Services, and the Governor's Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting. This cross-agency structure reflected the integrated nature of the social challenges we were addressing, but it also created coordination complexities that required developing new approaches to interagency collaboration. The team's first major challenge involved establishing information sharing protocols that could support coordinated service delivery while complying with federal confidentiality requirements, state privacy regulations, and individual organizational policy. Each participating agency operated under different legal frameworks that governed how client information could be collected, stored, and shared with other organizations. Creating systematic coordination would require developing common protocols that satisfied all applicable requirements, while enabling effective collaboration. The second major challenge involved developing performance metrics that could accurately measure the effectiveness of coordination and prevention approaches, while satisfying the evaluation requirements of federal grant oversight, state budget accountability, and academic research standards. Traditional social services evaluation focused on immediate outputs that could be easily quantified, but the interventions we were implementing were designed to achieve long-term outcomes that might not be apparent for months or years after initial service delivery. The third challenge involved managing the political dynamics that could affect pilot implementation and evaluation. Multiple state legislators had expressed interest in monitoring pilot outcomes as they considered broader social services funding decisions. Several advocacy organizations had requested detailed information about pilot design and implementation procedures. Local media outlets had begun reporting on the federal grant and its potential implications for social services delivery throughout Arizona. These external stakeholders possessed varying levels of understanding about social policy research and different expectations about what pilot programs could realistically achieve within the 3-year grant period. Managing these relationships would require developing communication strategies that could maintain political support for innovation while setting realistic expectations about pilot timelines and outcomes. As I prepared to begin pilot implementation, I reflected on the professional journey that had brought me from answering crisis calls during overnight shifts to leading state-level policy innovation initiatives. The analytical skills I had developed through county research were essential for pilot design, but successful implementation would require developing new capabilities in project management, stakeholder coordination, and strategic communication. More importantly, I understood that the next 18 months would determine whether my approach to evidence-based policy development could achieve measurable improvements in how social services operated throughout Arizona. Success would position me for even greater policy leadership opportunities and could influence how other states approached similar challenges. Failure would not only affect my career prospects but could also set back efforts to improve social services effectiveness throughout the region. The pilot programs represented more than professional advancement opportunities. They were tests of whether rigorous analysis and systematic implementation could achieve meaningful social change, whether public sector innovation could compete with private sector efficiency, and whether someone with my background and approach could contribute to solving some of society's most persistent challenges. Standing in my state office, reviewing the implementation plans that had been approved by department leadership, I realized that I was about to begin the most consequential work of my career. The coordination and prevention strategies I would be implementing over the following months would eventually become the foundation for policy innovations that attracted national attention and gubernatorial recognition. But first, I needed to prove that the theoretical frameworks I had developed could be translated into operational programs that achieved measurable improvements in efficiency and effectiveness while maintaining the political support necessary for long-term sustainability. The implementation of the Integrated Services Coordination Initiative began on a Monday morning in March, with a meeting that would fundamentally alter how social services operated in metropolitan Phoenix. Representatives from 5 major service organizations gathered in the Department of Economic Security conference room to begin the most ambitious coordination experiment in Arizona's social services history. The atmosphere was simultaneously charged with possibility and weighted with skepticism, as seasoned professionals who had spent decades working independently prepared to collaborate in ways that challenged every assumption about how their organizations function. The organizations participating in the pilot represented the core infrastructure of social services delivery in Maricopa County. Phoenix Family Housing Coalition managed emergency shelter and transitional housing programs, serving approximately 1,200 families annually. Desert Employment Services provided job training, placement assistance, and career development support for individuals transitioning from unemployment or underemployment. Arizona Mental Health Collaborative offered outpatient counseling, case management, and psychiatric services for adults dealing with depression, anxiety, trauma, and other mental health challenges. Substance Recovery Network operated treatment programs, support groups, and recovery maintenance services for individuals addressing alcohol and drug dependency. Community Family Support administered child development programs, parenting education, and family crisis intervention services. Each organization had developed sophisticated expertise within their specialized service area, but they had operated independently for so long that coordination seemed almost counterintuitive. Housing providers focused on rapid placement into available units without systematically considering whether clients had employment prospects that could sustain long-term tenancy. Employment services concentrated on skill development and job placement without routinely assessing whether participants had stable housing that would enable consistent work attendance. Mental health programs emphasized therapeutic progress without automatically coordinating with housing and employment services that could reinforce treatment gains through improved life circumstances. The coordination challenge was not simply operational but fundamentally philosophical. Each organization had developed service delivery approaches based on their understanding of what their clients needed most urgently. But comprehensive coordination would require acknowledging that sustainable outcomes often depended on addressing multiple challenges simultaneously rather than sequentially. Jennifer Martinez, director of Phoenix Family Housing Coalition, articulated this challenge during the initial coordination meeting. She explained that housing programs had traditionally prioritized speed of placement because homeless families faced immediate safety risks that could not wait for comprehensive service planning. However, she acknowledged that rapid placement without coordinated support services often resulted in housing instability when families could not address the underlying factors that had contributed to their homelessness. Robert Thompson, executive director of Desert Employment Services, described similar tensions between immediate service delivery and comprehensive support. Employment programs measured success primarily through job placement rates and initial wage levels, but long-term employment retention depended on factors that extended beyond job skills, including housing stability, transportation reliability, childcare availability, and mental health support. Thompson recognized that employment services could achieve better outcomes through coordination with other programs, but implementing such coordination would require developing new evaluation approaches that measured long-term sustainability rather than immediate placement statistics. The philosophical alignment necessary for effective coordination emerged gradually through a series of structured discussions that I facilitated over the first month of pilot implementation. Rather than attempting to impose coordination from above, I worked with each organization to identify how systematic collaboration could advance their existing goals while improving outcomes for their clients. The breakthrough came when Susan Chen from Arizona Mental Health Collaborative observed that her clients often struggled to maintain therapeutic progress because housing instability and employment stress created ongoing crises that undermined treatment effectiveness. Chen realized that coordinating with housing and employment services could actually enhance mental health outcomes by addressing environmental factors that contributed to psychological distress. This insight led to the development of what we termed integrated service plan, an approach that began with comprehensive assessment of each client's multiple needs and continued with coordinated service delivery that addressed housing, employment, mental health, and family support simultaneously rather than sequentially. Integrated planning required developing new intake procedures that gathered information relevant to all participating programs, coordinated case management that involved representatives from multiple organizations, and shared outcome tracking that measured progress across all service areas. The technology infrastructure necessary for supporting integrated planning proved to be one of the most complex aspects of pilot implementation. Each organization operated different client management systems that had been designed for their specific service delivery requirement. Creating coordination would require developing information sharing protocols that could connect these different systems while protecting client confidentiality and complying with federal privacy regulations. Working with the Department of Economic Security's Information Technology team, we developed a secure coordination platform that allowed participating organizations to share relevant client information while maintaining control over sensitive data that was specific to their service area. Mental health programs could share general information about treatment participation and progress without revealing specific therapeutic content. Employment services could provide information about job placement and retention without disclosing detailed employment history. Housing programs could communicate about placement status and tenancy stability without revealing personal information about family circumstance. The coordination platform also enabled systematic tracking of client outcomes across multiple service areas, allowing us to measure whether integrated service planning achieved better results than traditional approaches that addressed different challenges independently. This comprehensive tracking capability would be essential for evaluating pilot effectiveness and determining whether coordination strategies should be expanded beyond the initial pilot site. The first integrated service planning case involved Maria Rodriguez, a 34-year-old single mother of 3 children who had become homeless after losing her job as a medical assistant due to a workplace injury that triggered chronic pain issues. Maria's situation required housing assistance for her family, employment support for transitioning to work that accommodated her physical limitations, mental health services for addressing depression and anxiety related to her circumstances, and family support for helping her children adjust to housing instability and school disruptions. Under traditional service delivery approaches, Maria would have contacted each organization separately, completed different intake procedures for each type of assistance, worked with different case managers who had limited information about her other service needs, and received interventions that might have conflicted with each other or created contradictory requirements for her time and attention. The integrated approach began with a comprehensive assessment that involved representatives from all participating organizations, meeting with Maria simultaneously to understand her complete situation and develop a coordinated support plan. The housing representative identified appropriate temporary and permanent housing options, while considering proximity to employment opportunities and her children's schools. The employment specialist developed a job search strategy that focused on positions that could accommodate her physical limitations, while providing sufficient income to support housing stability. The mental health counselor designed a treatment plan that addressed both individual therapy needs and family counseling to support her children through the transition. The family support coordinator arranged childcare assistance, educational advocacy, and connection with community resources that could provide ongoing stability. This coordinated approach required significantly more initial time investment than traditional intake procedures, but it eliminated the duplication and contradiction that typically occurred when multiple organizations served the same individual independently. More importantly, it enabled the development of a comprehensive support strategy that addressed the interconnected factors contributing to Maria's housing instability, rather than just treating individual symptoms. The implementation of integrated service planning required extensive staff training across all participating organizations. Case managers needed to learn how to conduct comprehensive assessments that gathered information relevant to multiple service areas. Intake specialists required training in coordination protocols that could protect client confidentiality while facilitating appropriate information sharing. Supervisors needed to understand how to evaluate coordinated service delivery and measure outcomes that reflected progress across multiple program areas. Rodriguez assigned me to develop and deliver this training, which involved creating curricula that could build coordination capabilities while respecting each organization's existing expertise and operational requirements. The training program emphasized that coordination was intended to enhance rather than replace specialized service delivery, and that each organization would maintain primary responsibility for their core service area, while contributing to comprehensive support planning. The staff response to coordination training revealed both the potential benefits and the implementation challenges associated with integrated service delivery. Experienced case managers recognized that coordination could address frustrations they had experienced when clients struggled with challenges that extended beyond their service area. However, they also expressed concerns about increased workload, additional documentation requirements, and potential conflicts between different organizations' service approaches. Frontline staff members were particularly concerned about how coordination would affect their relationships with clients and their ability to provide specialized services effectively. Mental health counselors worried that involvement from housing and employment specialists might interfere with therapeutic relationships. Employment counselors questioned whether comprehensive service planning would delay job placement activities that clients needed urgently. Housing specialists expressed concern that coordination requirements might slow placement processes when families needed immediate shelter. Addressing these concerns required developing coordination protocols that preserved each organization's core competencies while enabling systematic collaboration. We established guidelines that defined when coordination was appropriate, how information would be shared between organizations, and how conflicts between different service approaches would be resolved. We also created evaluation procedures that could measure whether coordination improved outcomes without compromising service quality within individual program areas. 6 months after beginning implementation of the Integrated Services Coordination Initiative, we had served 43 individuals and families through coordinated service planning, while continuing to serve additional clients through traditional approach. This parallel service delivery enabled us to compare outcomes between coordinated and traditional approaches, while maintaining service availability for all eligible clients. The preliminary results exceeded our most optimistic projection. Clients who received coordinated services achieved housing stability at rates that were 47% higher than clients served through traditional approach. Employment retention among coordinated service recipients was 63% higher than traditional service clients at the 6-month follow-up point. Mental health treatment completion rates increased by 34% when services were coordinated with housing and employment support. Most significantly, the average cost per client served through coordinated approaches was 28% lower than traditional service delivery, primarily because coordination reduced the need for repeated interventions and emergency service. Clients who received comprehensive support were less likely to require additional housing assistance, less likely to need repeated mental health crisis interventions, and more likely to achieve employment stability that reduced their ongoing need for social services. These early results attracted attention from federal grant oversight agencies, state legislative budget committees, and academic researchers who specialized in social services evaluation. Patricia Williams from Arizona State University's School of Social Work requested permission to conduct an independent evaluation of pilot outcomes as part of a broader research project on social services innovation. The National Association of Counties selected our coordination initiative as a case study for their annual conference on evidence-based policy implementation. More importantly for my career trajectory, Department Director Linda Morrison began including updates about pilot outcomes in her regular briefings to Governor Morrison's policy staff. The governor's office had identified social services reform as a priority area for demonstrating Arizona's leadership in evidence-based policy innovation, and our pilot results suggested that coordination and prevention strategies could achieve measurable improvements in both service effectiveness and cost efficiency. Director Morrison scheduled a briefing session where I would present pilot findings directly to the governor's senior policy team, including Chief of Staff Michael Torres, Budget Director Sarah Chen, and Policy Advisor Jennifer Rodriguez. This presentation would be my first opportunity to communicate policy recommendations to officials who advised the governor on statewide policy priorities and budget allocation. The governor's policy team operated from the Executive Tower, a building adjacent to the state capitol that housed the administrative offices supporting the governor's policy development and implementation activity. The briefing room featured advanced presentation technology, secure communication systems, and furnishings that reflected the formal nature of gubernatorial policy deliberations. My presentation focused on 3 primary themes that had emerged from pilot implementation. First, I demonstrated that systematic coordination between social services organizations could achieve better client outcomes while reducing per capita service delivery costs. Second, I showed that integrated service planning addressed the root causes of social problems more effectively than traditional approaches that treated individual symptoms independently. Third, I argued that successful coordination strategies could be scaled throughout Arizona to achieve statewide improvements in social services effectiveness, while generating substantial cost savings for state and local government. The response from the governor's policy team was more engaged and more strategic than I had anticipated. Chief of Staff Torres asked detailed questions about the political feasibility of scaling coordination approaches statewide, including potential resistance from existing service providers and legislative support requirements for implementing systematic changes to social services funding mechanisms. Budget Director Chen focused on the fiscal implications of coordination strategies, requesting comprehensive cost-benefit analyses that could inform budget recommendations for the upcoming legislative session. Chen also inquired about the timeline for generating sufficient outcome data to support requests for additional funding to expand coordination initiatives beyond the pilot phase. Policy Advisor Rodriguez asked whether coordination strategies could be applied to other social policy areas beyond housing, employment, and mental health service. She specifically mentioned interest in applying integrated approaches to education support services, healthcare coordination, and criminal justice reentry programs, that faced similar challenges with service fragmentation and poor coordination between different agencies. The most significant response came when Chief of Staff Torres asked whether I would be interested in joining the governor's policy team to lead development of a comprehensive social services reform initiative that could position Arizona as a national model for evidence-based policy innovation. This opportunity would involve designing statewide coordination strategies, managing implementation across multiple state agencies, and representing Arizona in national policy discussions about social services reform. The offer represented a transition from pilot program management to senior policy leadership that could influence how social services operated throughout Arizona while contributing to national discussions about evidence-based social policy. It also represented recognition that my analytical approach and implementation experience had positioned me as a credible expert in social services coordination and prevention strategy. However, accepting this position would require leaving the Department of Economic Security and transitioning into the governor's office, where policy work operated under different pressures and different timelines than agency-based research and pilot implementation. Work in the governor's office would be more visible, more political, and more directly connected to the governor's overall policy agenda and re-election considerations. As I considered this opportunity during the drive home from the executive brief, I realized that the coordination strategies I had developed and implemented through pilot programs had positioned me for exactly the kind of policy leadership role I had envisioned when I first chose social work as my field of study. The path from crisis center work to county research to state pilot implementation had created a foundation of expertise and demonstrated competence that qualified me for senior policy positions that could influence how social problems were addressed throughout Arizona and potentially beyond. Decision to accept or decline the governor's offer would determine whether my career continued to advance toward greater policy influence and whether my approach to evidence-based social services reform could achieve the statewide impact that Director Morrison and the governor's policy team envisioning. The executive tower of the Arizona State Capitol complex represented the operational heart of state government, where policy decisions affecting 4 million residents were conceived, debated, and implemented. Walking through its marble corridors for the first time as a member of Governor Patricia Morrison's senior policy team, I understood that I had crossed a threshold that separated policy advisors from policy implementers, strategists from administrators, and decision influencers from decision executors. The weight of this transition extended beyond professional advancement to encompass responsibility for policy outcomes that could affect hundreds of thousands of families throughout Arizona. My new role as Senior Policy Advisor for Social Services Innovation positioned me within the governor's inner circle of policy development specialists, who worked directly with Governor Morrison to shape her administration's approach to the most complex challenges facing Arizona. The position carried authority to coordinate policy development across multiple state agencies, represent Arizona in national policy discussions, and advise the governor on strategic decisions that would define her administration's legacy in social services. The governor's policy team operated according to principles that differed significantly from the agency-based environment where I had developed my expertise. Policy development at the gubernatorial level required balancing evidence-based analysis with political feasibility assessments, long-term strategic planning with immediate crisis management, and comprehensive reform visions with incremental implementation realities. Most importantly, all policy recommendations needed to align with Governor Morrison's broader political agenda while serving the legitimate needs of Arizona residents. Chief of Staff Michael Torres provided my initial orientation to gubernatorial policy development processes during a comprehensive briefing session that outlined expectations, procedures, and performance standards for senior policy advisors. Torres emphasized that effective policy advisors needed to understand not only the technical aspects of their subject matter expertise, but also the political dynamics that influenced legislative support, stakeholder acceptance, and public opinion regarding proposed policy change. Torres explained that Governor Morrison had identified social services reform as a signature policy initiative for her administration, with particular emphasis on demonstrating that evidence-based approaches could achieve better outcomes at lower costs than traditional government programs. The successful implementation of coordination and prevention strategies could position Arizona as a national leader in social policy innovation, while providing political benefits that supported the governor's re-election prospects and potential future political ambition. However, Torres also cautioned that high-profile policy initiatives attracted intense scrutiny from legislative opponents, advocacy organizations, and media outlets that could amplify any implementation problems or disappointing outcomes. The visibility that accompanied gubernatorial policy leadership created opportunities for significant influence, but also generated risks that could affect both policy outcomes and career trajectory. Budget Director Sarah Chen focused my orientation on the fiscal constraints that influenced all policy development within the governor's office. Arizona operated under constitutional requirements for balanced budgets, legislative restrictions on tax increases, and federal mandates that limited flexibility in social services funding allocation. Any policy innovations needed to demonstrate measurable cost savings or revenue generation that could offset implementation expenses while achieving projected improvements in service delivery effectiveness. Chen emphasized that successful policy advisors needed to develop comprehensive understanding of state budget processes, federal funding regulations, and legislative appropriation procedures that affected their policy area. Social services reform initiatives would require navigating complex funding streams that involved federal grants, state general fund allocations, county matching requirement, nonprofit organization partnerships that each operated under different financial constraints and accountability requirements. Policy advisor Jennifer Rodriguez briefed me on stakeholder management strategies that were essential for successful policy implementation at the state level. Social services reform affected multiple constituencies that possessed different priorities, different political influences, and different capacities for supporting or opposing proposed change. Effective policy development required systematic engagement with service providers, advocacy organizations, legislative committees, county governments, and community groups that could influence implementation success. Rodriguez explained that stakeholder management involved more than consultation and communication. It required understanding the political and economic interests that motivated different organizations, identifying potential areas of cooperation and conflict, and developing implementation strategies that could maintain sufficient stakeholder support while achieving policy objectives that served broader public interest. The first major policy initiative assigned to me involved developing a comprehensive statewide expansion plan for the coordination and prevention strategies that had proven successful in the pilot program. Governor Morrison had committed to scaling these innovations throughout Arizona during her next State of the State address, and my responsibility was to design implementation approaches that could achieve systematic improvements in social services delivery while maintaining political support and fiscal sustainability. The statewide expansion challenge was significantly more complex than pilot program implementation because it required coordinating policy changes across 15 counties that possessed different service delivery capacities, different political leadership, and different relationships with state government. Rural counties operated social services programs that were smaller and less specialized than urban programs, but they also served populations that faced different challenges and required different intervention approaches. Maricopa County, which included metropolitan Phoenix, served approximately 60% of Arizona's population through sophisticated social services infrastructure that could readily implement coordination and prevention strategies. Pima County, anchored by Tucson, possessed substantial service delivery capacity but operated under different political leadership that maintained skeptical attitudes toward state government policy initiatives. The remaining 13 counties served rural and tribal populations through limited social services infrastructure that might require significant capacity building before coordination strategies could be implemented effectively. The political complexity of statewide expansion required developing implementation approaches that respected county autonomy while ensuring consistency in coordination standards and outcome measurement. County governments, possessed constitutional authority over many social services functions, and successful statewide implementation would require voluntary cooperation rather than state government mandates that could generate political resistance or legal challenge. I spent the first month in the governor's office, conducting comprehensive stakeholder consultations with county commissioners, social services directors, nonprofit organization leaders, and advocacy group representatives throughout Arizona. These consultations revealed significant variation in local capacity, political priorities, and implementation readiness that would need to be addressed through differentiated expansion strategies rather than uniform statewide approaches. The stakeholder consultations also revealed broader political dynamics that could affect expansion success. Several county commissioners expressed concerns about unfunded mandates that might require local governments to assume additional responsibilities without corresponding state funding increases. Some nonprofit organizations worried that coordination requirements might interfere with their existing service delivery approaches or create administrative burdens that diverted resources from direct service. Legislative Republicans questioned whether social services expansion represented appropriate use of state resources or whether such programs should remain primarily county and nonprofit responsibility. These political concerns required developing expansion strategies that could demonstrate clear benefits for local stakeholders while addressing legitimate concerns about implementation costs, administrative complexity, and state government overreach. The expansion plan needed to provide sufficient flexibility for local adaptation while maintaining coordination standards that could achieve measurable improvements in service delivery effectiveness. The technical aspects of statewide expansion required developing standardized coordination protocols that could be implemented across organizations with different technological capabilities, different staff training levels, and different service delivery volume. The coordination platform that had been successfully implemented in the pilot programs needed to be scaled to accommodate hundreds of organizations, serving tens of thousands of clients annually throughout Arizona. Working with the state's Information Technology Department, I developed specifications for a comprehensive social services coordination system that could support information sharing, coordinated service planning, and outcome tracking across multiple organizations and counties. The system design incorporated security features that could protect client confidentiality, reporting capabilities that could satisfy federal grant requirements, and user interfaces that could accommodate varying levels of technological sophistication among participating organizations. The coordination system also needed to integrate with existing state agency databases, county information systems, and federal reporting requirements that affected social services delivery throughout Arizona. This integration challenge required extensive consultation with technology specialists, database administrators, and compliance officers who understood the regulatory environment that governed social services information management. After 3 months of stakeholder consultation, technical planning, and political analysis, I had developed a comprehensive statewide expansion proposal that addressed the coordination, prevention, and capacity building requirements for implementing social services reform throughout Arizona. The proposal included differentiated implementation timelines that reflected varying county readiness levels, funding strategies that combined federal grants with state appropriations and local matching requirement, and evaluation frameworks that could measure outcomes while accommodating different local service delivery approaches. The expansion proposal also included workforce development components that would provide training and technical assistance for social services staff throughout Arizona. Policy modification recommendations that would align state regulations with coordination objectives and communication strategies that would build public understanding and political support for social services reform initiative. Governor Morrison reviewed the expansion proposal during a senior staff meeting that included all members of her policy team, key agency directors, and political advisors who specialized in legislative relations and public opinion management. The governor's response demonstrated both her commitment to social services reform and her understanding of the political challenges that accompanied ambitious policy initiatives. Governor Morrison expressed strong support for the technical aspects of the expansion proposal, particularly the evidence-based approach to coordination and prevention that had demonstrated measurable improvements in pilot program outcomes. She emphasized that social services reform represented a core commitment of her administration, and that successful implementation could position Arizona as a national model for evidence-based social policy innovation. However, the governor also identified political challenges that would need to be addressed before announcing the statewide expansion initiative. Republican legislative leadership had expressed skepticism about expanding state government roles in social services delivery, preferring approaches that emphasized private sector solutions and reduced government spending. Some Democratic legislators worried that coordination requirements might interfere with existing programs that served their constituents effectively. Governor Morrison assigned me to work with her legislative liaison team to develop political strategies that could build bipartisan support for social services reform, while addressing legitimate concerns about implementation costs, government overreach, and program effectiveness. This assignment required developing comprehensive understanding of legislative dynamics, stakeholder politics, and communication strategies that extended beyond my previous experience in agency-based policy development. The legislative strategy development process involved extensive consultations with committee chairs, party leadership, and individual legislators who possessed influence over social services appropriations and policy decisions. These consultations revealed complex political calculations that affected legislative support for social services reform initiatives. Republican legislators generally supported efficiency improvements and cost reduction measures that could reduce government spending while maintaining service quality. However, they expressed concern that coordination initiatives might expand state government authority over county and nonprofit organization operations. Some Republicans worried that social services expansion could create dependency relationships that discouraged personal responsibility and economic self-sufficiency. Democratic legislators strongly supported expanded social services, but worried that coordination requirements might reduce service availability or create bureaucratic barriers that prevented eligible individuals from accessing assistance. Some Democrats questioned whether efficiency-focused reforms might be used to justify funding reductions that would ultimately harm vulnerable populations. Independent and moderate legislators from both parties expressed interest in evidence-based approaches that could demonstrate measurable improvements in service delivery effectiveness. However, they required comprehensive outcome data and cost-benefit analyses that could justify the initial investments required for implementing coordination and prevention strategies. Building legislative support required developing compromise approaches that could address these different concerns, while maintaining the core coordination and prevention strategies that had proven effective in pilot programs. The legislative strategy emphasized efficiency improvements and cost savings that appealed to fiscal conservatives, while highlighting improved client outcomes and expanded service availability that satisfied progressive priorities. The compromise approach included provisions for local flexibility in implementation approaches, sunset clauses that would require periodic legislative review of program effectiveness, and performance standards that would trigger funding adjustments based on measured outcomes. These provisions addressed concerns about state government overreach, while maintaining accountability requirements that could ensure implementation. After 6 months of political strategy development and stakeholder negotiation, Governor Morrison approved the final version of the statewide social services reform initiative that would be announced during her upcoming State of the State address. The announcement would position Arizona as a national leader in evidence-based social policy, while demonstrating the governor's commitment to innovative approaches that could achieve better outcomes at lower cost. The State of the State address represented the culmination of 18 months of policy development work that had evolved from pilot program implementation to comprehensive statewide reform planning. Standing in the governor's office, as she reviewed the final draft of her speech, I realized that the analytical approaches I had developed through crisis center work and county research had positioned me to influence policy decisions that could affect hundreds of thousands of Arizona residents. The journey from answering crisis calls during overnight shifts to advising the governor on statewide policy reform had required developing new skills, accepting increasing responsibilities, and proving competence through measurable results rather than traditional credentials. The coordination and prevention strategies that would be announced during the State of the State address represented the translation of evidence-based analysis into operational programs that could demonstrate meaningful improvements in social services delivery. However, the announcement would also mark the beginning of the most challenging phase of policy implementation, requiring management of statewide coordination across multiple agencies, counties, and organizations, while maintaining political support and demonstrating continued effectiveness. The success or failure of statewide implementation would determine whether my approach to evidence-based social policy could achieve lasting improvements in how Arizona addressed persistent social challenges. More importantly for my long-term career trajectory, successful implementation of statewide social services reform would position me for even greater policy leadership opportunities, and could establish credibility for addressing broader social policy challenges that extended beyond Arizona. The work ahead would require sustaining the analytical rigor and implementation excellence that had brought me to the governor's policy team, while managing the political and administrative complexities that accompanied high-profile policy initiatives. The evening before the State of the State address, I reflected on the professional journey that had brought me from invisible crisis worker to senior policy advisor, working directly with the governor to design and implement comprehensive social services reform. The path had required patience, persistence, and willingness to pursue meaningful work despite limited initial recognition or financial reward. Standing in the executive tower, reviewing final preparations for announcing the most ambitious social services reform initiative in Arizona history, I understood that I had achieved exactly the kind of policy influence I had envisioned when I first chose public service as my career focus. The upcoming announcement would demonstrate that evidence-based approaches to social policy could achieve measurable improvements while building the political support necessary for sustainable implementation. The Arizona State Capitol House chamber possessed the weight of history and the grandeur befitting momentous policy announcements that would shape the direction of state government for years to come. Built during the territorial period and renovated multiple times to accommodate modern legislative functions, the chamber featured mahogany galleries, brass fixtures, and the ceremonial atmosphere appropriate for Governor Patricia Morrison's annual State of the State address. 160 legislators occupied the chamber floor, while gallery seating accommodated state agency directors, advocacy organization leaders, media representatives, and distinguished guests who had been invited to witness the governor's policy agenda for the upcoming legislative session. I occupied a designated seat in the executive gallery, positioned where I could observe legislative reactions to the social services reform initiative that had consumed 8 months of comprehensive policy development. The speech text that Governor Morrison would deliver contained detailed descriptions of coordination and prevention strategies that had evolved from my pilot program research through statewide expansion planning. The governor would announce the most ambitious social services reform initiative in Arizona history, positioning the state as a national leader in evidence-based policy innovation while demonstrating her administration's commitment to achieving measurable improvements in government effectiveness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.